Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Last Lincoln Republican, The Presidential Election of 1880, by Benjamin T. Arrington. Narrated by Paul Heitsch. Editor's Foreword. It is at once a blessing and a curse that we historians know how the stories we tell turn out. Too often, our omniscience both shapes and skews the narrative. The overused term antebellum comes to mind. Things participants in the story could not possibly know or foresee become reminders of an outcome that, because it is known, seems inevitable, a word historians ought never use. It is also a blessing and a curse that, over time, a conventional wisdom about events, individuals, periods, and themes can emerge that allows synthesis and simplicity on the one hand, and impedes new interpretations and bold insights on the other. Such is the case with American political history covering the final quarter of the 19th century. Google forgettable presidents, and the names Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, and Harrison pop up. To differentiate these presidents from one another, the most common observation is that some had beards and some did not. Recently, however, a new generation of scholars has challenged this conventional wisdom and sought to move the narrative out of its deeply beaten interpretive grooves. Of these, Benjamin T. Arrington occupies a conspicuous place. In this volume, he lays to rest the old clichés while summarizing and synthesizing the latest scholarship and drawing from it larger and important themes. To be sure, the reader cannot forget the assassin lurking just off stage. But because of the richness of the election story and the particular promise of the Garfield presidency, that knowledge, in Arrington's skillful hands, adds great meaning to the choice facing the electorate. According to Arrington, James A. Garfield, improbable Republican nominee for the presidency in 1880, was the last true Lincoln Republican. By this, he means that the Civil War veteran from Ohio was seriously committed to making good on the promises of emancipation and Reconstruction. An assassin's bullet relegated Garfield to the footnotes of history and thwarted freedmen's opportunity to secure the rights that would elude their grasp for nearly another century. Might-have-beens, of course, are also both a blessing and a curse. But in the story of Garfield's rise to prominence, the appeal of his candidacy, and his early days in office, readers can discern possibilities never realized, purposes never achieved. All this makes the election of 1880 far more important than historians have realized. Arrington notes that 1880 was the only election that pitted war veterans against each other, and service in the Union cause was a prerequisite for a viable candidacy. Moreover, Garfield prevailed by the narrowest of electoral margins. Yet, as the Democratic Party's dependence on the Solid South became apparent, the Republicans' overtures to business clearly delineated the differences between the parties. Differences that, in time, would have less to do with race and equality, and more to do with managing a dynamic and increasingly complex economy. Jim Crow's strange career had begun. Introduction. The general public and historians alike tend to view several of the post-Civil War presidents, from Ulysses S. Grant to William McKinley, as interchangeable and mostly unimportant. College history textbooks sometimes misidentify them, showing a photo of James A. Garfield with the caption, Rutherford B. Hayes. In the early 20th century, Thomas Wolfe reinforced this belief in his short story, From Death to Morning, calling these men the Lost Americans, and noting that their gravely vacant and bewhiskered faces mixed, melted, swam together, Which had the whiskers, which the sideburns? Which was which? In many circles, these views persist. When asked what they know about Garfield, people visiting the James A. Garfield National Historic Site in Ohio often give the same three answers. He was president, he had a beard, and he got shot. These things are all true, and visitors cannot really be held accountable for their lack of knowledge when, for decades, even many academic historians have reinforced the idea articulated by Wolfe, that the presidency was just a giant black hole filled with nobodies from the death of Abraham Lincoln until the era of Theodore Roosevelt. Recently, though, things have started to change. Some skilled writers have turned their attention to Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, taking a second look at American leaders from those eras. The public's renewed interest in and curiosity about America's past leaders may be a response to the increasingly fractured and divisive state of modern American politics. Perhaps the ongoing arguments about racial, social, and economic equality have made Americans hungry for information about elected officials who championed equality and bipartisanship. The post-Civil War period offers a number of examples. Despite decades of minimal interest, recent scholarship has taken a fresh look at several presidents from this era. Ron Chernow's Grant, for instance, goes to great lengths to show how much President Ulysses S. Grant did to promote and ensure the political freedoms of former slaves in the South, including outlawing the Ku Klux Klan. Candace Millard's Destiny of the Republic, A Tale of Madness, Medicine, and the Murder of a President, is ostensibly about President Garfield's assassination, but the author does a masterful job of demonstrating his qualifications to hold such high office, in large measure because of his dedication to racial equality. For those curious about the origins and transformation of the Party of Lincoln, Heather Cox Richardson's To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party, shows that the party began as one dedicated to equal opportunity for all Americans. Richardson argues that the Republicans occasionally lost their way but managed to course-correct through a series of transformative figures who returned the party to its equal opportunity roots: Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and Dwight D. Eisenhower. The time seems right for a re-examination of the presidency during the so-called Gilded Age and the elections that brought these leaders to power. For many years, the University Press of Kansas has published books on presidential elections, and this work on the 1880 election is part of that series. The 1880 presidential election pitted Republican James Garfield against Democrat Winfield Scott Hancock, but it also offered the country two very different philosophies and visions from which to choose. Garfield, a 9-term member of the House of Representatives and a U.S. Senator-elect from Ohio, was a seasoned politician, but few saw his nomination for president coming. Although there were pre-convention whispers about Garfield as a possible nominee, hardly anyone thought much beyond the potential candidacies of former President Grant, Senator James Blaine, and Secretary of the Treasury John Sherman. In fact, Garfield attended the convention in Chicago to nominate his fellow Ohioan Sherman. On the Democratic side, the real drama was whether Samuel J. Tilden would seek the nomination. Tilden had been the Democratic nominee in 1876, besting Republican Rutherford B. Hayes by more than 250,000 popular votes, but ultimately losing the electoral vote in a contentious, disputed election decided by a congressionally appointed commission, of which Garfield was a member. Democrats spent the entirety of Hayes' administration, 1877 to 1881, claiming that Tilden had been robbed and urging him to run again in 1880 to claim the White House to which he had been rightfully elected 4 years earlier. Once Tilden chose not to run, or more accurately, wasted his opportunity for renomination by playing coy and waiting for the party to seek him out and nominate him unanimously, General Winfield Scott Hancock emerged as a popular choice. Hancock was the opposite of Garfield, a political novice with no experience in elected office. A native Pennsylvanian, Hancock was a West Point graduate, career military officer, and Mexican-American War veteran who had been wounded several times fighting for the United States in the Civil War. Hancock was somewhat adept at navigating Army politics, but he knew little about national elective politics. However, because of a brief post-war stint commanding the 5th Military District in New Orleans, Hancock, despite fighting against the Confederacy, was an acceptable choice to Southern white Democrats who were desperate to reestablish white supremacy in the South. Northern Democrats liked that Hancock's status as a bona fide Union war hero and a current active duty general negated the Republicans' most powerful argument for retaining power, the theory that the Democrats were unfit to govern because their party of rebels had sent thousands of Union soldiers to their graves. This was often called waving the bloody shirt, and it allowed the Republicans to remind voters of their own loyalty to the Union, their emancipation of the enslaved during the war, and their efforts to ensure black rights after it. Interestingly, as white Democrats desperately sought to reassert power and white supremacy in the South, both major candidates in the 1880 election were Union military veterans. Once the ballots were counted, that election would provide the first evidence of a so-called solid South for those Democrats who had overthrown Reconstruction and hoped to regain legal and societal dominance over black people, some of the very things Garfield had battled during his long service in Congress. During this era, the candidates' respective political parties did the hard work of running national campaigns. For the most part, presidential candidates were expected to be neither seen nor heard. President Hayes advised Garfield to stay home and say nothing. Garfield, however, broke with tradition to some degree by running the nation's first front porch campaign from his home in Mentor, Ohio. Hancock stayed out of the public eye, and for good reason. During one of the few interviews he granted, he made a major misstatement that gave the Republicans ammunition to use against him. Hesitant to be too critical of Hancock because of his long military career and distinguished war record, Republicans took advantage when the Democratic candidate played into their hands and proved himself to be an inexperienced politician, not quite ready for prime time, as modern Americans might say. Both parties were determined in 1880, Republicans to hold on to the presidency and Democrats to capture it. Would the result have been the same had either party nominated someone else? Both parties were in transition in 1880. The Republicans were looking for new alliances with industrialists and financiers, on their way to becoming the party of big business. The Democrats were trying to straddle the fence between reestablishing white supremacy in the South and garnering enough national appeal to win the presidency. Despite being a compromise nominee in 1880, Garfield was exactly the right man for that time in the Republicans' history, and the nation's. A fierce opponent of slavery before the Civil War and a Union volunteer during it, Garfield had spent years in Congress fighting for civil rights for black Americans. Although some of the things he said and wrote privately might make us cringe today, he was usually a reliable vote for legislation designed to lift up freed people in the South. Even as many Republicans moved away from civil rights as a major issue, Garfield remained convinced that the government could and should continue to help black people realize the rights to which the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution entitled them. Hancock, in contrast, had no national political record for the Democratic Party to publicize or for the voters to examine. Thus, the Democrats' primary argument was that Hancock should be elected to right the electoral wrong done to Samuel Tilden 4 years earlier. Garfield was the last true Lincoln Republican to occupy the White House. He represented the Republican Party's origins as a party dedicated to equal opportunity for all Americans, and to some extent, that vision died with him. This compounds the tragedy of his death. Had he lived, he might have been one of those transformative figures Richardson examines in To Make Men Free. For that reason, I spend more time on Garfield and the Republicans than on Hancock and the Democrats. At least, in terms of their written platforms, there was little separating the two parties in 1880 anyway. Ultimately, civil service reform, not civil rights, dominated the Republicans' behind-the-scenes campaign and Garfield's presidency. Then, just a few months into his administration, that same issue led a mentally unstable man to shoot Garfield. However, it seems fair to postulate that had he lived, Garfield would have continued to press Congress and the American people on civil rights for everyone. After all, he dedicated a significant portion of his inaugural address to this very issue. I do not devote a significant amount of time to third-party movements, just one short chapter examining all of them. The Greenback Party campaign of James B. Weaver was the most significant. Although Weaver won more than 300,000 popular votes, he did not win any electoral votes, and the Greenback Party was all but dissolved before the end of the 1880s. An extended examination of the Greenbackers and other fringe parties would have distracted from my focus on the two main candidates and the two major parties from which the American voters still choose, although party members of the 1880s would likely find the Democratic and Republican parties of today unrecognizable. In response to Thomas Wolfe, then, yes, both Garfield and Hancock mattered in 1880 and still matter today. The two veterans of the Civil War engaged in a political battle between June and November 1880 that, for all they knew, might forever change the direction of American politics and history. All presidential elections and presidential administrations matter, and they all affect us as a nation for years and decades afterward. I am grateful to the many authors and historians now researching and writing about Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, so that we might make sense of our history and better understand how the United States became the nation it is today. I hope readers will come away with a stronger appreciation for not just the people, but also the competing political philosophies of 1880. I believe those voters made the correct choice when they elected, albeit very narrowly, James A. Garfield that year, and the American people were denied a potentially strong and effective leader when he died. 1. Halfway between God and the Devil. The election of 1876 and its aftermath. The 1880 presidential election actually began 4 months before the 1876 election. This timing will not seem unusual to 21st century readers or those interested in modern politics, but it was out of the ordinary for the late 19th century. During this period, candidates rarely campaigned or appeared in public when seeking the presidency, and the political parties did most of the heavy lifting of presidential campaigns. Before the creation of modern primaries and caucuses, this included selecting candidates at national nominating conventions. Unlike today, voters had no direct voice in choosing their party's presidential standard-bearers every 4 years. The event that set the 1880 election in motion more than 4 years earlier took place on July 8, 1876, when that year's Republican nominee, Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes, issued the customary letter accepting his party's nomination. The Republicans had nominated Hayes and running mate William Wheeler on the 7th ballot at their national convention in Cincinnati in June. President Ulysses S. Grant had considered seeking an unprecedented third term, but ultimately chose to adhere to the as-yet unbroken tradition of presidents limiting themselves to 2 full terms, following the example of George Washington. From his office in Columbus, Hayes wrote, "The Declaration of Principles by the Cincinnati Convention makes no announcement in favor of a single presidential term. I do not assume to add to that declaration, but believing that the restoration of the civil service to the system established by Washington and followed by the early presidents can best be accomplished by an executive who is under no temptation to use the patronage of his office to promote his own re-election, I desire to perform what I regard as a duty in stating now my inflexible purpose, if elected, not to be a candidate for election to a second term. Thus, the Republicans knew more than 4 years before the 1880 election that they would have to select a candidate other than Hayes as their presidential nominee that year. The letter also made it clear that, if elected, Hayes intended to make civil service reform, ending the patronage system of federal job distribution in favor of a merit-based system, a focus of his single term. Republican Congressman James A. Garfield of Ohio, known primarily for his support of civil rights for the formerly enslaved, still told his diary that reformation of the civil service is needed for every department of the government. The president who will devote a term to that reform and make it sure will stand among the foremost benefactors of his country. Hayes' letter of acceptance pleased Garfield, who called it a very clear and sensible document. Garfield likely envisioned that a reformed civil service would provide more federal job opportunities for black men. Not all Republicans agreed with Hayes and Garfield on the necessity of civil service reform. Many elected officials of both major parties remained firmly dedicated to the patronage system, which allowed them to dole out government positions to friends, relatives, and cronies as the spoils of electoral victory. Shrewd politicians understood that patronage gave them the means to build and expand their bases of power by placing loyalists in important positions at nearly all levels of government. Few were eager to voluntarily abandon this system. Powerful Republicans, including President Grant and Senators Roscoe Conkling of New York and John Logan of Illinois, scoffed at or took offense to Hayes' letter. Grant believed that Hayes' pledge to serve a single term was a veiled criticism of him, and Conkling and Logan, both Grant loyalists and masters of patronage, rejected the idea of civil service reform. Logan called the letter damned stuff, and Conkling, somewhat ominously, said nothing. Candidate Hayes also addressed Reconstruction and the civil rights of black Americans in his acceptance letter. By 1876, all but 3 southern states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, had been redeemed from Republican rule by Democrats who sought to reassert white social and political supremacy. Hayes, a decorated Civil War veteran, assured white Southerners that he would treat them fairly, but he emphasized, "There can be no enduring peace if the constitutional rights of any portion of the people are habitually disregarded. All parts of the Constitution are sacred, and must be sacredly observed, the parts that are new no less than the parts that are old." The rule of law, he wrote, was paramount and would be enforced in all sections of the country. Yet Hayes also included a statement about bringing the South the blessings of honest and capable self-government. Historian Eric Foner writes that these were code words for an end to Reconstruction. Although ending Reconstruction as a whole was of interest to white Southerners, black voting rights were of paramount concern. Hayes' emphasis on civil service reform and civil rights for black people was in accordance with the platform the Republicans approved at their Cincinnati convention. The first 3 of the platform's 18 planks referred to civil rights, without offering any specific plans or steps to ensure them, stating that until all Americans received equal treatment, the work of the Republican Party is unfinished. In its one statement on the federal civil service, the platform did not use the word reform. It opined that jobs should be filled by persons selected with sole reference to the efficiency of the public service and the right of citizens to share in the honor of rendering faithful service to their country. Despite Hayes' reputation as a reformer of sorts while governor of Ohio and his expressed desire to reform the civil service, many took this statement as support for, not opposition to, the patronage system. The platform's lack of specificity on civil rights and its veiled intimation about ending Reconstruction troubled some, including orator, abolitionist, and civil rights advocate Frederick Douglass. In a speech to the Republican National Convention on June 14, 1876, the day before the platform was officially adopted, Douglass challenged the party of Lincoln. "What does it amount to if the black man, after having been made free by the letter of your law, is unable to exercise that freedom, and after having been freed from the slaveholder's lash, he is to be subject to the slaveholder's shotgun?" During the campaign, the Republicans argued about whether they should focus on the general theme of reform or the danger of giving the rebels the government, as Hayes called it. This prompted Douglass to write to Republican Chairman Zachariah Chandler, "It is the same old conflict, liberty, union, and civilization on the one hand, and slavery, disunion, and barbarism on the other." While the Republicans sought desperately to hold on to the presidency in 1876, they knew that 8 years of scandals and bad press during the Grant administration made their 16-year grip on the White House tenuous. Most of the South's return to the control of Democratic redeemers also complicated Republicans' path to victory in the nation's centennial year. Republicans knew they could not run or win on the record of the Grant administration. Though few doubted that Grant was personally honest, he had often surrounded himself with men less interested in doing the country's business than in lining their own pockets. Therefore, Republicans in 1876 resurrected the tried-and-true argument linking all Democrats to treason, rebellion, and the slaughter of Union soldiers, waving the bloody shirt, which had worked so well in the previous 2 elections. Robert Ingersoll of Illinois, who initially backed James Blaine for the Republican nomination but campaigned heartily for Hayes, told a meeting of Union veterans during the campaign, "Every man that endeavored to tear the old flag from the heaven that it enriches was a Democrat. Every man that tried to destroy this nation was a Democrat. The man that assassinated Abraham Lincoln was a Democrat. Soldiers, every scar you have on your heroic bodies was given you by a Democrat." Despite this strategy, Democrats smelled blood in the water. They knew that New York's 35 electoral votes were the biggest prize, and their candidate had to carry the nation's most populous state if they were to have any chance of winning. This made New York Governor Samuel J. Tilden an early frontrunner for the Democratic nomination. Many New Yorkers revered Tilden for his prosecution of the infamous Tweed Ring, which had ruled New York City's Democratic Party and political patronage system for years until Tilden brought it down. That achievement had won him New York's governorship in 1874, and many correctly suspected that Tilden had his eye on the White House. He and Indiana Governor Thomas Hendricks were considered the favorites for the 1876 Democratic nomination, as the party prepared to convene that summer in St. Louis. Tilden, a millionaire several times over and a brilliant campaign organizer, worked harder for his own nomination and spent more of his own money to secure it than any previous presidential nominee of either party. One letter writer to the Cincinnati Enquirer described Tilden's pursuit of the nomination. "He treats the nomination as a matter of business, to be made successful by management, as patent medicine is by liberal advertising." Besides Tilden and Hendricks, a smattering of other prominent Democrats had some support for the nomination. Pennsylvanian Winfield Scott Hancock, one of the Union's ablest and most decorated commanders during the Civil War, was a lifelong Democrat, known to harbor presidential ambitions despite never having held elective office. Still on active duty, General Hancock was viewed as palatable to the South because of his time as commander of the Texas-Louisiana Military District during Reconstruction. Senator Thomas Bayard of Delaware was the first choice of many Northeastern Democrats who were not pledged to Tilden. He was also preferred by many white Southerners, and this alone made him unacceptable to others. Republicans would have little trouble waving the bloody shirt in the face of a Democratic nominee favored by former Confederates. Bayard himself recognized this drawback and willingly
Sample complete. Ready to continue?